Welcome, Mr. Martin's IB biology class. We've put together this deep dive just for you.
That's right. We've been looking at some really interesting material on climate change and how it's affecting ecosystems.
And our mission today is basically to pull out the key ideas, the most important concepts and examples to help make this pretty complex topic, clearer and easier to grasp.
Think of it as hitting the highlights, connecting the dots on the drivers, and consequences of climate change. Maybe adding some context to what you're covering in class.
Okay, perfect. So let's start with the foundation, the greenhouse effect. Most people have heard of it, right? It's basically how Earth stays, well, livable.
Exactly, the natural greenhouse effect. You can think of it like a garden greenhouse. The sun's energy comes in.
Through the glass.
Right, and the glass traps some of the heat inside, keeping it warm. Our atmosphere has gases that do something similar.
Greenhouse gases, like water vapor, carbon dioxide. What else?
Methane, nitrogen oxides. Those are the main players in the natural effect. They trap heat.
And it's about different kinds of energy, isn't it? Shortwave from the sun.
Yep, the sun sends energy as shortwave radiation. Visible light, mostly. The Earth absorbs it, warms up, and then radiates heat back out.
As longer waves, infrared heat.
Exactly, long-wave radiation. And that's the energy the greenhouse gases are really good at absorbing and re-radiating back down. They trap some of it.
Which keeps the planet warm enough for life. Without it, we'd be frozen.
Absolutely. It's a crucial natural process. But the issue now is the enhanced greenhouse effect.
Enhanced because of us. Human activities.
Precisely. We're adding extra greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, thickening that blanket, so to speak.
And the big one everyone talks about is carbon dioxide, CO2, mainly from burning fossil fuels.
That's the largest source, yes. Burning coal, oil, gas for energy, transport. It releases huge amounts of CO2.
And cutting down forests, too. Deforestation.
Yes, that's significant. Trees absorb CO2 through photosynthesis. So fewer forests mean less CO2 is taken out of the atmosphere.
Okay, so CO2 is key. What about methane? You mentioned that earlier.
Methane's important, too. It comes from things like landfill sites where organic waste decomposes without oxygen.
And farming. I've heard about cows.
Yeah, ruminant animals like cattle release methane during digestion. Agriculture is a major source.
And scientists have tracked this, right? There's a strong link, a correlation between the concentration of these gases in the atmosphere and global temperatures over time.
Oh, definitely. The data is very clear. More greenhouse gases correlate with higher global average temperatures.
So this enhanced greenhouse effect driven by human activities is what's causing the climate to change.
That's the core mechanism. And it gets more complicated because the warming itself can trigger other processes that cause even more warming.
Ah, you mean positive feedback cycles? Like a snowball effect?
Exactly like that.
Oh.
A change happens, which triggers another effect, which in turn amplifies the original change. It can push things faster than you'd expect.
Okay, let's unpack some of those. You mentioned the oceans. They absorb CO2, but warming affects that.
Right, oceans are huge carbon sinks. But the solubility of CO2 in water depends on temperature. Colder water holds more CO2.
So as the oceans warm up?
They become less efficient at absorbing CO2 from the atmosphere. More CO2 stays in the air, which causes more warming, which further warms the oceans. You see the cycle.
Okay, I get it. What's another one? Something about ice.
Yes, the loss of reflective ice. It's about albedo.
Albedo. That's just how reflective a surface is, right? White reflects more, dark absorbs more.
Exactly. Ice and snow have high albedo. They reflect a lot of sunlight back into space, which helps keep the planet cool.
But if the ice melts...
You replace bright reflective ice with darker ocean water or land. These darker surfaces absorb more solar energy, more heat.
Which leads to more warming and melts more ice, another cycle.
Precisely. Then there's permafrost.
That permanently frozen ground in Arctic regions.
Well, previously permanently frozen ground. As it thaws due to warming, vast amounts of organic material frozen inside start to decompose.
And decomposition releases gases.
Yes, carbon dioxide and, importantly, methane, which is a potent greenhouse gas itself.
So thawing permafrost releases greenhouse gases, causing more warming, which thaws more permafrost. Wow.
It's a major concern, yeah. And linked to warming is the increase in droughts and wildfires.
How does that feedback? More fires release CO2, obviously.
They do. Huge amounts of carbon stored in trees and vegetation go up in smoke. Plus, the drought conditions that often precede these fires stress the plants.
Making them less able to absorb CO2 in the first place.
Right. And after a fire, you've lost that photosynthetic capacity until the forest recovers, which can take a long time. So it's a double hit, releasing stored carbon and reducing future uptake.
These feedback loops sound like they could really destabilize things, which brings us to the idea of tipping points.
Yeah, tipping points are critical thresholds. It's when the environmental changes and these positive feedbacks become so strong that they overwhelm an ecosystem's ability to bounce back.
And it shifts into a completely different state, possibly irreversibly.
That's the idea. It crosses a threshold and reorganizes into something new, which might be much less desirable for us or for the species living there.
Let's take an example. The notes mentioned the boreal forests, the taiga.
Right. Those vast northern forests,
Yeah,
normally they are a net carbon sink.
meaning they absorb more CO2 than they release.
Yes, because of cold, often wet conditions mean decomposition of dead organic matter is very slow. So carbon builds up in the soil and vegetation over long periods.
But warming changes that.
It does. Higher temperatures can lead to drier conditions, maybe less water availability, which reduces photosynthesis. The trees are stressed.
We hear about forest browning instead of greening sometimes.
Exactly. Lower primary productivity. And crucially, these warmer, drier conditions increase the risk of wildfires.
Which we just said release a lot of CO2.
Yes, and in these old forests, it can release carbon that's been locked away for centuries, sometimes called legacy carbon. So, intense fires can flip the whole system.
From a carbon sink to a carbon source.
Potentially, yes. If the warming and fires become frequent or severe enough, the whole ecosystem structure could collapse and change into something else, like grassland or sparse woodland, releasing huge amounts of carbon in the process. That's a potential tipping point scenario.
That's sobering.
Hmm.
Let's shift to impacts we can already see quite clearly. Polar habitats seem particularly vulnerable.
They really are. Warming is happening faster in the Arctic, for instance. The melting of ice, both sea ice floating on the ocean and landfast ice attached to the coast, is dramatic.
And this directly impacts the animals that depend on that ice, like emperor penguins.
Yes, in Antarctica. They need stable sea ice, often landfast ice, for breeding. They lay their eggs and raise their chicks on the ice during the winter.
So if the ice forms later, breaks up earlier, or isn't stable.
The breeding colonies can fail. Chicks might not survive if the ice platform disappears before they're ready to swim. It's a direct threat to their populations.
And in the Arctic, I remember reading about walruses. They use sea ice too, don't they?
They do. They use it as platforms to rest between feeding dives and especially for mothers to nurse their pups.
So less sea ice means.
They're forced to haul out on land in massive, crowded groups, which can be dangerous. Pups can get crushed. Also, they may have to travel much further from their feeding grounds to find places to rest, using up vital energy.
So it's not just polar species. Are other animals and plants shifting where they live?
Absolutely. Every species has environmental limits, conditions it can tolerate its fundamental niche. As climates warm, those conditions shift geographically.
So species try to follow the conditions they're adapted to, moving towards the poles.
That's a major trend we see poleward shifts. For example, analysis shows many species ranges in the northern hemisphere are moving northwards. Boreal forests, for instance, might contract at their southern edge and expand north.
And moving uphill, too, to higher elevations.
Yes, that's another common pattern, upslope shifts. As lower altitudes warm, cooler conditions move up the mountainsides, and some species follow.
Like those birds in Papua New Guinea you mentioned.
Exactly. Studies there have documented birds shifting their ranges to higher elevations over recent decades, consistent with finding cooler temperatures upslope. It's like moving poleward, but vertically.
Okay, let's turn to the oceans again. We talked about warming and CO2 absorption, but what about currents and nutrients?
Ocean currents are vital. They transport heat around the globe, influencing climate, but they also transport nutrients.
Nutrients for marine life.
Yes, particularly a process called upwelling. This is where colder, deeper water, which is usually rich in nutrients like nitrates and phosphates, rises to the surface.
And that fuels the base of the food web, like phytoplankton.
Precisely. Phytoplankton blooms in these nutrient-rich surface waters are the foundation of many productive marine ecosystems.
How does climate change affect this upwelling?
Well, as the surface ocean warms, the water becomes less dense. This can create a stronger stratification, a more stable layering of warm surface water over cold, deep water.
Making it harder for the deeper water to mix upwards.
Exactly. Increased stratification can weaken or suppress nutrient upwelling in some areas. Less nutrient supply means less phytoplankton growth.
Which means less food for fish and everything else up the food chain.
Yes, it can reduce the overall primary production and the energy available throughout the marine ecosystem.
And speaking of marine ecosystems in trouble, coral reefs, they seem to be on the front line.
They absolutely are. Coral reefs are incredibly sensitive ecosystems, facing a kind of double whammy from climate change.
First is the warming water causing bleaching.
Right. Corals have this vital symbiotic relationship with tiny algae called zooxanthellae living in their tissues. The algae photosynthesize and provide food for the coral.
But when the water gets too hot,
The corals become stressed and expel the algae. This causes the coral to turn white, hence bleaching, and lose its primary food source. If the heat stress lasts too long, the coral will die.
and the second part of the double whammy,
Ocean acidification. As the ocean absorbs more atmospheric CO2, the water chemistry changes. It forms carbonic acid.
making the water more acidic, lower pH.
Yes. And crucially, this process reduces the availability of carbonate ions in the water.
Which corals need to build their skeletons.
Exactly. Their skeletons are made of calcium carbonate. Less available carbonate ions makes it harder for them to grow their skeletons, and existing skeletons might even start to dissolve slowly. It weakens them.
So they're getting starved by bleaching and weakened by acidification.
That's the devastating combination. It's leading to widespread coral mortality and the potential collapse of entire reef ecosystems, which are hotspots of biodiversity.
It sounds quite bleak. Are there things we can do to actively remove CO2, carbon sequestration?
Yes, that's an area of intense research and effort. Sequestration means capturing CO2 from the atmosphere and storing it long term.
Nature already does this, right? Like forests.
Forests are major natural carbon sinks, so are peat-forming wetlands. We can try to enhance these natural processes.
How? Planting more trees.
That's one way. Afforestation, planting trees on land that wasn't recently forested. And reforestation or forest regeneration, helping forests grow back after logging or disturbance.
Are there downsides, like planting just one type of fast-growing tree?
Well, monocultures might store carbon quickly, but they can be less resilient to disease or climate stress and often don't support the same level of biodiversity as a natural diverse forest. So how it's done matters.
Okay. And what about those peat wetlands you mentioned? How do they store carbon?
Peatlands form in waterlogged, often acidic conditions. The lack of oxygen in the waterlogged soil dramatically slows down the decomposition of dead plant material.
So the plant matter just builds up.
Yes, as partially decomposed organic matter called peat, this peat can accumulate over thousands of years, locking away huge amounts of carbon.
Can we help protect or restore them?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Many peatlands have been drained for agriculture or forestry. Restoring the water levels in drained peatlands can help stop the release of stored carbon and allow them to start accumulating peat again, turning them back into active carbon sinks.
Okay, so let's try to pull this together. We started with the enhanced greenhouse effect, humans adding gases like CO2 and methane.
Which traps more heat, causing global warming.
Then we saw how that warming can trigger positive feedbacks like melting ice reducing albedo or thawing permafrost, releasing more gases, which accelerate the change.
Making the warming potentially faster and leading towards possible tipping points.
Where ecosystems like the boreal forest might shift dramatically, even becoming carbon sources instead of sinks.
And we looked at direct impacts. Polar species losing vital ice habitats, other species shifting ranges poleward and upslope to track changing climates.
Plus, major ocean changes impacts on nutrient cycles and the severe threats of warming and acidification to coral reefs.
It really highlights how interconnected everything is and how climate change impacts ripple through entire ecosystems.
And the underlying driver, as we've established, is primarily human activity increasing greenhouse gas concentrations.
Which really leads to a crucial point for all of you listening from Mr. Martin's class. Thinking about all these changes, what might the long-term consequences be for biodiversity, for ecosystem services, even for human societies?
And how does the science you're learning help us understand these complex processes and maybe, hopefully, find ways to mitigate the worst effects?
That's definitely food for thought as you continue your IB biology journey.
A really important question to ponder. Well, that brings us towards the end of this deep dive. We genuinely hope this discussion has helped clarify some of the key links between climate change and the Earth's vital ecosystems.
We hope it's been useful for your studies.
And if you found this deep dive helpful, please do give us a like, consider subscribing, maybe leave a comment with your thoughts, and definitely tell your friends and classmates about the deep dive.